Kathleen Hicks. I direct our international security program here at CSIS, and I want to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion of our new report, Escalation and Deterrence in the Second Space Age. Before we begin, just a quick reminder on safety and security. Should a fire alarm go off, we have doors behind all of you that lead out onto Rhode Island Avenue. There are two doors back behind me that go out the back side of the building, so just follow my directions in that case. I want to introduce everyone we have on the panel here, and then we're going to start with a presentation on the report and its conclusions, findings, and then we will engage in a more interactive discussion, and of course include you in the audience in that. And hopefully we'll get this all wrapped up at 4 o'clock, so we'll be at a brisk pace for you. To my immediate left is Todd Harrison. Todd directs our Aerospace Security Program. He also directs our Defense Budget Analysis Program. He will be speaking primarily in hat number 1 today, but who knows, maybe Defense Budget will find its way into the discussion. To his left is Zach Cooper. Zach is a senior fellow in the Asia program as well as the International Security Program, which makes him unique here in the center. He is the senior fellow for Asian security. To the next one down, I will stop saying to the left, if you will. The next one down is Teresa Hitchens, who is a senior research associate at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland, where she focuses on space security, cyber security, and governance issues surrounding disruptive technologies. And all the way at the end there is Bruce McDonald, who's an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, just across the street practically, focusing on crisis stability in the space and cyber domains, as well as nuclear nonproliferation. I also want to note that his recent book will be, I think, featured prominently, if you will, and to the extent that it crosses with the issues we're talking about here today on crisis stability in space. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Todd and then Zach to give a presentation on the study.
Thank you, Kath, and thank you everyone for joining us here today on the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the space age. And so I wanted to start, one of the premises in our report is that we are in a different space age now and have been for some time. As you can see on this chart, we have divided the era into two ages, the first space age from 1957 to 1990, and then the breaking point in 1991, when it happens to correspond to a significant shift in geopolitics with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but also a shift in the way our military uses space with the 1991 Gulf War, which was the first major combat operations in U.S. history where space played a pretty significant role. We introduced new capabilities like GPS and satellite communications and missile warning systems that we applied to a conventional conflict for the first time in a major way. And of course, those changes in the way the military uses space for conventional conflicts have only continued throughout the second space age. The second space age, we're citing is running from 1991 to the present era. Now, you'll notice this chart shows the number of space launches by country over time. So you notice in the first space age, it was very clearly dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. 93% of the launches in the first space age were by the US and Soviets. Just 7% were from all other countries in the world combined. Now, you also notice that there were a much larger number of Soviet launches during that time. That's because the United States, after the mid-60s, we figured out how to make our satellites last longer, so we didn't have to launch as many. Of course, the Soviets focused more on just launching more frequently with satellites that did not tend to last as long. And of course, the Soviets, from this, gained a lot of experience in launch vehicles that really carries through to today. And one of our major launch platforms, this has been a subject of debate in recent years, the Atlas V uses a Russian-made engine, RD-180 engine, because they're very good at making rocket engines and launch vehicles. Also, during the first space age, 70% of the satellites launched were for military purposes, and just 4% were for commercial purposes. So space was primarily bipolar, and it was primarily for military purposes. Now, I would also note that often People like to talk about how space is now a contested domain. It was contested from the very beginning. The first ASAT test took place in 1959, just 2 years after the first successful orbiting of a man-made object. And so it has been contested from the very beginning, but things are different now. It is increasingly more contested. In the second space age, 39% of the launches have been from other countries other than the U.S. and Russia so far. 36% of the satellites in the second space age have been commercial, and that's only going to grow. In recent years, the majority of launches and the majority of satellites have actually been from countries other than the United States and Russia. So other countries are making increasingly use of space, as are commercial ventures. Now, what we cite in the report as the defining characteristics of the second space age are the 4 Ds, we like to call them. It's more diverse, disruptive, disordered, and dangerous. It's more diverse because, as I mentioned before, more countries are fielding space capabilities for military, civil, and commercial purposes. And we've also seen a real explosion of innovation and activity in the commercial space sector. It's more disruptive because some of these new entrants into the space market, commercial companies, are disrupting their various sectors. A good example of this is in the space launch market, what SpaceX and Blue Origin are doing with developing reusable space launch systems. It's being very disruptive and driving down the price of space launch. We also see a lot of new commercial missions coming online, and they're in areas that used to be dominated by governments, in particular the U.S. government. We see commercial companies are putting up signals intelligence satellites, SIGINT. Commercial companies are putting up space-based radar. We also have commercial companies that are proposing ventures to go do things like space mining that were, never really considered in the first space age. It's also more disordered now because our current laws and regulations and treaties were not really designed with a lot of these new missions and commercial activities in mind. And policymakers in the U.S. and in other countries are really scrambling to try to catch up and update things like how they do licensing and how they handle new missions. And we're also trying to catch up on what do we need to do for space traffic management, which is not something any one country can do on its own because it's inherently a global domain. It has to be done internationally somehow. And of course, finally here, I think space has gotten more dangerous in the second space age. The U.S. military and many of our allies are increasingly dependent on space-based capabilities for the way we fight at all levels of conflict, from the low end to the high end. But we're also dependent on these military space systems that were designed for a different era. The difference, as I said before, it's not that space is suddenly contested. It was always contested, and it's always been militarized. It's been used for military purposes. The difference is that our adversaries are increasingly developing counter-space capabilities. And those counter-space capabilities, in some cases, they're relatively inexpensive. They're proliferating to less sophisticated adversaries and even non-state actors. And our targets in space have become more attractive because we're so much more dependent on them. So really the difference now is that more countries have the ability and the incentive to fight back in space. That really is what's making space a more dangerous domain now. I won't expect you to read all of this because this is the details are contained in the report, but I just put this up here to show that one of the things we look at in the report is how the threats to space systems are probably more wide-ranging than a lot of people would expect. We also looked at, you can see on the vertical, the rows here, on the side, left-hand side, are different characteristics of different types of attacks. So we looked at everything from your kinetic physical attacks, like an ASAT weapon that blows something up on orbit, to non-kinetic physical attacks, so like a laser or high-power microwave that can physically damage a satellite. We also looked at electronic threats, things like jamming and spoofing, and cyber threats that can disable or disrupt your space systems, either in space or the ground systems that help control them. Now, most attention is usually focused on the kinetic physical threats to space systems, and in particular, the direct ascent ASAT weapons. And I don't mean to minimize that as a threat in any way, but there are many other threats that are less expensive for adversaries, and given their characteristics, these other threats can actually be more dangerous in a way and more likely that someone would try to use them. At the high end, of course, your kinetic direct ASAT weapons, they're highly attributable. We'll know, the United States at least will know where it was launched from. It requires relatively advanced technology. You have to have, a launch vehicle. You have to have a homing system that can target a satellite. You have to know very precisely where the satellite is you're trying to target. The effects are irreversible. Once you blow up a satellite, it's gone. You can't reverse that. And it can produce effects like space debris that are visible, and other people will know that it happened. At the other end of the spectrum, an example is uplink jamming. It's fully reversible. You can turn a jammer on and off as many times as you want. It can, in some cases, be difficult to attribute where the jamming is coming from, especially if you locate the jammer in an area where there are lots of other things that are transmitting up and down. And if that jammer is mobile and you can turn it on and off, it can be very difficult to figure out where it is and who's doing it. You could deploy a jammer in a third country. It doesn't have to be on your territory. And things like jammers do not necessarily require sophisticated technology, so it's within the reach of many more potential adversaries. So the problem today is that we're using our military space systems to support the full spectrum of conflict, but they're not designed to be resilient against the full spectrum of threats. And nearly all the military satellites that we have and use today were designed for a relatively benign environment because they were protected by assumption. The assumption was during the first space age that they would be tied to nuclear deterrence, that if you attacked our space systems, we used them primarily during the first space age for the nuclear mission, and so we would regard that as a prelude or part of a first strike. And so they were protected by nuclear deterrence. The challenge now is that's just not as credible anymore because we use these systems for far more than just nuclear missions. And in many cases, the same systems have both a nuclear and a conventional capability on them. We've aggregated those functions together. And so is it really credible that an adversary, particularly a non-nuclear adversary, is going to be deterred from doing things like jamming or lasing or a cyber attack against our space systems? Are they really going to, is it credible that we would launch a nuclear attack against them because they took some of these actions against our systems in space? We didn't think it was, and that's why we wanted to dive into the subject matter and study it. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Zach.
Great. Well, thank you, Todd. So I'll just walk you through a couple of our top-line findings on escalation and deterrence dynamics. And there's a lot more in the report, but I wanted to start off with the foundations of deterrence theory. And this is really the statement that deterrence equals capability times credibility times communication of those two. And so the point of this and the reason that it's important in space is that often we focus on the capability to deter, right? The ability to deter through denial or through punishment. Or we focus on the credibility of those capabilities and their use. But often we forget about the communication part. And communication in space is particularly difficult, in part because communicating your space capabilities may actually give away the capabilities themselves, which is not always the case in some other domains. And so this is one of the real challenges, and this comes back to the 5 elements, the characteristics that Todd talked about earlier: attribution, reversibility, resilience, thresholds, and asymmetries. So I want to walk through each of those 5 in the next few minutes. And where we started with some of this research is the acknowledgement that there are some parallels between the world of massive retaliation in the nuclear domain. If you go back to the 1950s, the US was struggling with some of the same questions in the first nuclear age that it has struggled with in the first space age. So the actors were primarily the US and the USSR. Their capabilities were very substantial when you compared them to other players, but the US still had a large edge in its nuclear capabilities. Well, if you fast forward to the 1960s, where the US has to adopt a flexible response policy, you see that there are a larger number of actors with nuclear capabilities, and you see that the Soviet capabilities have matured, and in some senses, these are eroding US advantages. And this is not to say that the connections between the nuclear domain and the space domain are perfect. There are some really important differences that we can get into. But it's just to acknowledge that deterrence theorists, even classical Cold War deterrence theorists, have struggled with some of the same questions that we're struggling with today in the space domain back in the 1950s and 1960s in the nuclear domain. And one of the key lessons is that you have to tailor your deterrence capabilities and your strategies much more carefully to the threats that you're facing. So with that in mind, we conducted a tabletop exercise with our friends at the Secure World Foundation, some of whom I see here. And I just want to walk you very briefly through the game structure. And first, we started with 4 fictional countries. You can find more about this in our report. Each of those countries had varying degrees of space capabilities and terrestrial capabilities. The chart that I've just put up is so small that you can't read it, but I promise you that it has varying capabilities of different types. And basically it walks through a detailed history of each country and the force list, and you can find this all in the background materials of our report. And each of these teams was given both private information and public information. So there were some things they knew about their own capabilities that other teams didn't know, and there were some things they knew about their objectives that other teams also did not know. Finally, participants were brought together from a variety of different backgrounds, from commercial expertise to research institutions to governments, and from a variety of different countries. So we were trying to get a large number of diverse backgrounds to actually look at escalation and deterrence dynamics. And what we did is we challenged them with 3 scenarios. I won't go into detail now on the scenarios. I'll just say that the first scenario focused on what we call inadvertent escalation, and this was really an accident, so not an intended escalation in any way. The second scenario was also inadvertent escalation, but here was from miscalculation. So it was a decision that one state made that it didn't think would lead to escalation, rather than an outright accident. And the third scenario was advertent escalation. This is what we often think of as more intentional escalation. And what we tried to test in each of these scenarios was whether the actors would act differently in each of these cases. These are the sort of 3 main types of deterrence and escalation cases. And so in the report, you can find about 20 or 30 pages of background on exactly what happened in each one of these cases and how they were prosecuted. And I know we'd be very happy to talk more about this in the question and answer session. The key for us was that we came away with lessons about 4 different topics: attribution, resilience, thresholds, and asymmetries. On attribution, one of the key takeaways for us was that the high capability teams emphasized attribution more than the low capability teams. So if you were a team that looked more like, say, the United States, you were more likely to think that attribution was important. If you were a less capable team, you were likely to sort of ignore attribution because it seemed too difficult, either for your country to do or maybe even for other countries to do. So this was a real asymmetry in the game, and one that I think surprised us a bit. Second, we looked at resilience. And teams were quite effective at working through problems with resilience. They worked through fairly destabilizing attacks on their satellites. And I would say one impressive part of the tabletop exercise for us was the ability of teams to fight through these challenges, work through these problems. The third bucket is thresholds, and we had 3 findings here. The first was that teams were reluctant to use kinetic attacks in space. And I'll note, in space there is critical. Teams were actually more likely in some cases to use terrestrial attacks on ground stations, than they were to attack space systems in orbit, which was a real surprise for some of us. Second, teams tended to employ cyber attacks quite often and early. And third, teams preferred to escalate in domains other than space. Now, admittedly, we had a group of space experts together, and I think there's some danger when you have space experts in a room that they don't want to damage their precious systems. But I think this is one thing that's worth looking at and discussing in greater detail. And then the final finding was that teams really struggled to understand asymmetries and to understand how to differentiate between tactical and strategic systems. That was a continuing problem in the game. So I'm going to put up 6 overall findings. We talk more about these in the report, but I want to be brief so that we can get into the discussion. The first finding was that the U.S. should be investing in attribution, particularly for non-kinetic attacks. And this is a big hole. I think many people have recognized it, but in our tabletop exercise and in our research, it was a continuing problem. Second, the United States needs to, again, increase its resilience to reduce the benefits of attacks on space, and Todd mentioned this earlier. If the benefits of attacking U.S. space systems are high, the incentives to attack them are high, and so actually increasing resilience decreases your opponent's incentives to go after systems in space. Third, we need to rethink reversibility. Many people in deterrence literature think that you can have reversible options and that they're a sort of lesser form of escalation. But one thing we found in the simulation is that actually many of the participants in the simulation didn't see reversible actions as particularly benign compared to irreversible ones. And one reason is that you might not know whether something is reversible at the time that it happens. And so we found that it's incredibly important that we think more about reversibility and how it applies in space. Fourth, we have to identify escalation thresholds. The chart that Todd put up has a number of systems and some different characteristics among those. But what makes that so complicated is that you have a number of potential thresholds, but really little agreement in the international community about most of those thresholds and what crossing them would mean. And I know there's a lot of work going on internationally on this issue, but it's something that came up repeatedly both in our study and in the exercise. Fifth, the United States has to think about how to demonstrate its capabilities in space and to work with its allies in this way. As I mentioned earlier, communication is a key part of deterrence. You can have the capability, you can have the credibility, but if you don't communicate those two, it likely won't matter. And so how we communicate that we have capabilities to respond is something that US leaders are going to have to struggle with increasingly. And finally, we have to build coalitions. The world in which the US and the Soviet Union existed in the Cold War is long gone. Now, when we think about space systems, we're often going to be thinking about hosted payloads, about shared infrastructure, and these kinds of developments are incredibly complicating for deterrence dynamics because it may mean that going after one US ally means going after the United States. And that's going to invoke a whole new set of deterrence characteristics that we haven't thought about a lot in the space world, even though we've thought about them a great deal in other communities. So with that, I want to turn it back to Kath and go on.
That's a very helpful summary. Thanks to both of you. And if I can start with Teresa, you, as I said in the introduction, have focused quite a bit on governance issues with regard to space. So from that perspective and the international organization perspective that you've brought to these issues in the past, or from any other, where are the areas that you find this study kind of hits the right notes? And if there are any places it misses it, welcome those thoughts as well.
Thank you. And first of all, I want to thank CSIS for inviting me here today. This is a very interesting report. I really do encourage you to read it. It's concise and it lays out a lot of the problems that we face today. I really was struck by the discussion on communication, and Zach was mentioning that. In the conclusions here, in the overall findings, we talk about demonstrate capabilities to communicate a credible deterrent. But we have to do other things before we do that. We actually have to communicate what are our actual goals and what are we trying to do, both nationally and internationally in space. And I think that involves more than just demonstrating that we can fight. It actually involves saying why and when, and talking to both allies and potential adversaries in a more meaningful way about what are those escalation thresholds, what are bright lines. I'm not talking red lines, everybody hates red lines, but bright lines, what do we consider to be untoward, not acceptable. This is something we've been trying to do in the international community ever since the 2013 UN Group of Governmental Experts report, and currently in the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, looking at the long-term sustainability of space. And those are efforts that are aimed at saying, okay, what's okay and what's not okay? But they're very slow, they're very complicated. They've been bogged down by the problems, especially between Russia and the United States since the Ukraine crisis in 2013. But we haven't done that kind of we haven't done the kinds of conversations that I think we had in the Cold War with the nuclear deterrent amongst ourselves in the public domain. I want to stress in the public domain, not behind closed doors, because one of the problems with being able to communicate on this, even with our allies, is what I consider to be an immense amount of overclassification of information and of capabilities. And I think that's a really huge problem that we have to think about. The other thing I wanted to mention is when we talk about deterrence, we often focus on deterrence by punishment, that is, showing people that we have the ability to punish you if you do something bad to us, okay? It's a classic form of deterrence. It was the underpinning of mutually assured destruction, for example, in the nuclear age. And recently, we've been focusing on deterrence by denial in the space domain, resiliency. That's great, because we do need to do that, and we've failed to do that over a long period of time. We've known about vulnerabilities forever, practically forever, in the space domain. We've been talking about them since the 90s. We've not put our money where our mouth is on that, and that's been a problem. But those aren't the only forms of deterrence. There's another form of deterrence, and it's called positive deterrence in some metrics, or assurance. And this means trying to let your adversaries know that they actually benefit from following the rules that you want them to follow, from not doing bad things, that there is an actual positive benefit to that, to not just your potential adversaries, but others out there in the field. And that's something I don't think we've thought a lot about. We're worried about potential adversaries in space. We're worried about capabilities of people who are not necessarily adversaries, but might be adversaries of other people, say India, for example. And yet we have not sat down, I don't think we've sat down, at least I haven't seen this in the international community, and said, this is what you gain from being a good player. This is what you, as a national government, gain. And explaining why we think that and why we think we gain from things like rules of the road. We have been, since the Obama administration anyway, promoting the idea of rules of the road in space. And we have to have that conversation in a more meaningful way. And those are two things that I would like to see more discussion about in the U.S. Discussion. And I would like to see a greater commitment to that in the international domain amongst the space actors. So thanks.
No, that's really good, and I think that tees up Bruce very well in crisis stability. So welcome your thoughts again on both the report and then more broadly the state of the field, if you will, on these issues. Where do we need better focus? Where are we doing pretty well?
Thanks, Kath. And again, I want to add my thanks to CSIS for holding this event and for inviting me here. This is a great piece of work that I hope that people here will read and take on board, because it's a real contribution to the field. And I love the idea of this second space age. I think they've nailed that. The report nails that concept very well. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time. Well, I guess we want to start out plugging the report that we at Johns Hopkins put out about a year ago on crisis stability in space. And somewhere here there should be a flyer that has the web link that you can download at no charge. But this whole issue of stability and deterrence in space, I'm so glad that the report, your report, spends a good bit of time on it. One of the things that is troubling for me is I see, and unless we can get survivability and resilience down right, the prospects for rapid escalation in space once a certain threshold and there's no bright red line of where that threshold is, the possibility for rapid escalation is, in my mind, is serious. And one of the problems, among many you can pick, is that what I call is there's so much uncertainty. We may think, one side may think that they are dazzling a satellite of another, but it may end up that they've actually fried the electronics. Of course, the country on the other side isn't going to say, oh, they didn't really mean to do that. They just meant to dazzle. No, they're going to think that the country intended to do that. And then that certainly could contribute to escalation. And furthermore, there is the question of uncertainty of effects. One thing I'm troubled by kinetic energy weapons and creating debris in space, but one thing about a kinetic energy weapon is that you know you've destroyed it when you see this big explosion in space. With cyber means, you may have destroyed it, but you may not get anywhere near the visual confirmation that, in fact, that you destroyed the weapon, and that introduces an element of uncertainty. And then what I call are catalytic or unintended effects, where you may have intended to destroy a certain capability, but it turns out that in what you've done, there's a catalytic effect that leads to much greater damage than you intended. And there's no a test range to go and practice these things. You can try to model it, and that's useful as far as it goes. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and so that's why I was very interested to see that in your tabletop exercise, that in fact people were, the teams were reluctant to go too far in space, and I don't know for sure why that was, but my sense is that, among other things, there is a lot of uncertainty. I also, parenthetically, I might say, they invited me to participate, but for a variety of reasons I was unable to, and I really regret that I was unable to participate in that tabletop exercise. So it's a new and troubling domain. Fortunately, we're not completely helpless here. We reckon it's a little late, but we recognize some of the problems. And also, I wanted to add one more thing that's too often overlooked, and that is that we are, although at times we can think that our allies can be a bit of a strain, of course, sometimes our allies think that we can be a bit of a strain, but we gain a lot, particularly in space, it seems to me, from our alliances, that if a country wants to engage us in space in a really serious way, they're going to end up engaging our allies. And of course, you know, our allies represent a substantial capability. In terms of pure economics, their GDP exceeds ours. And I think we should not underestimate that. There's plenty to worry about in this field, but that's one thing that I think we can take a certain level of comfort from. And I wouldn't swap our allies for China's allies, particularly when you look at North Korea or Russia and Belarus and a couple of others. So we should not forget about that. I could go on. There are many. This is a fascinating field with the different options and scenarios that are possible. But I'll just close by saying once again, it's a fine study and a real contribution to the field, and I look forward to the discussion, and presumably there'll be some Q&A as well.
That's great. I'm going to ask one last question, so the audience should get ready to ask their own. I'm going to start with Zach, but I suspect everyone, based on what you've already said, will have views on this. Obviously, you built your game structure around imaginary countries, but you do comment in the report very centrally about diversity of threats. And so much of deterrence is about, you know, as you said, tailoring it, understanding the perceptions. How confident are you in the United States understanding how other actors, primarily nation states, but other actors, think themselves about deterrence in space, and how can we improve that if that understanding is not great?
initial answer is not very confident. You know, the famous saying on deterrence, I think, is that it's one language, but it has many different dialects. And I think that's particularly true in space. You know, one of the big surprises after the Cold War that we learned about the Soviets was that they didn't think anything like we did about nuclear deterrence. Our basic concepts, which we thought were fairly obvious and well developed by the 70s, they didn't buy into many of the core concepts of the US deterrence literature, even through the end of the Cold War. And so I think there's very little reason to believe that foreign countries, even in some cases US allies, are going to be thinking about deterrence the same way that we do here in Washington. And that, again, you know, goes to this challenge of how do you communicate what your thresholds are? How do you, as Bruce was just saying, you know, how do you work with allies in an effective way to come up with plans that address the possibility of escalation? But I think that's one of the key challenges, that it's difficult in part because it's not just a theoretical challenge, it's a cultural challenge and something that is very difficult to talk about, particularly because we don't have examples of space conflicts.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Zach said. I have no confidence, none. And having worked in the international community, I see how easy it is for people, governments, to talk past each other. And I say something and the other person hears something else. And that happens a lot more than you might think. And it's very difficult. And this is not just with potential adversaries, it is with allies who don't necessarily understand what we're trying to do or what we're trying to say when we start talking about space or warfighting in space or deterrence in space. These terminologies that we use are interpreted differently in different places, and we have a really crucial problem with China. We don't understand what they want, what they don't want, what they're trying to achieve, and we have a tendency in the space field to assume that whatever China's doing in space is bad, that this is a zero-sum game, that any gain they make is a detriment to us. And that is a very dangerous game. And part of that is because we have failed in this country to figure out how to talk to China, how to share, in a way we did not fail with the Soviet Union. We started cooperating with the Soviet Union in space fairly early, before the end of the Cold War, okay? And so we learned at least to talk to each other and to work together in ways that allowed us to have greater understanding about capabilities, but also about intent. And we don't have that with China, and China's a rising space power and a rising power, and we are shooting ourselves in the foot by our continued unwillingness to open those doors to both communicate and cooperate with China, particularly in the civil space arena.
Yeah, and so I think one of the interesting things that came out of our crisis simulation exercise and our research on this is that, number one, we don't have a good understanding as the United States of our own thresholds and what they are. We don't have these bright lines yet. Part of that is because we don't have much experience in this domain. You know, it's only 60 years that we've been able to use space, and we haven't had a major conflict in space. And so we don't have that history like we do in other physical warfighting domains. Also, thresholds are situation dependent. And a type of attack in one situation might be viewed as highly escalatory, and in another situation, the exact same attack might not be viewed as being as escalatory. And then the other problem we have is our adversaries and our allies, as you were saying, don't necessarily view things the same way that we do. And so, you know, a good example would be, if you talk to someone from STRATCOM, they're likely to tell you that if another country uses a laser or something to dazzle our missile warning satellites, that's through the roof escalation right there. Like, that's off limits. Like, that's we're at war, man. You know, the nukes are coming if they do that. But you talk to people in other combatant commands, and they might say, well, but, you know, in this situation, they might be doing that, you know, because they're afraid of a, you know, conventional attack, or they're just trying to brush us back. And our allies might look at that and say, Well, that's not an attack. Nothing was destroyed. It's fully reversible. Your sensor will come back. It was just dazzled. Nothing's happened here. And so who knows what our adversary is thinking when they do that, and they may, in fact, just be exploiting the idea that we don't know what our thresholds are. So I think that's a big problem. Now, when it comes to countries like China, how can we get a better understanding of what their intent is in space? One of the things we did in the first space age is we partnered with the Soviets on civil space exploration. Even in the worst times of the Cold War, we still partnered with the Soviets on the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Even back in the 1960s, we were sharing data about weather satellites and various things. And then all the way through the end of the Soviet Union, cooperation on the Mir space station, and even today, even after Ukraine and all the tensions that have been going on with Russia in recent years, we are still partnered with them on the International Space Station. In fact, we're completely dependent on them to put our astronauts on the space station and bring them home. They are completely dependent on us to operate the space station. They couldn't do that without us. And it has survived all these tensions. That has given us insight into their space program because, like many nations, they commingle civil, military space programs. We don't have that kind of cooperation with China today. We don't have it with, with other countries like India that are really emerging space powers. And so maybe that is a way to facilitate better communication and understanding of each other is if we build a new coalition for space exploration in the future.
Great.
Yeah, if I could, excellent point, Todd. I just wanted to add to that. Another problem with the way we have stonewalled China when it comes to civil space cooperation is that China, one impact of it in dialogues that I've had with Chinese specialists is that the Chinese feel insulted and dissed, if you will, by our refusal to work with them when we do work with other countries. And I think that that's been a very counterproductive policy. I understand why the congressman who initially initiated that, was concerned about human rights, which is an entirely valid concern. But it's backfired on us. Ironically, we are able to have some dialogue on the defense side, but that has not been a productive mechanism for dialogue. But dialogue is important, even if we can't reach agreement. At least we can hope to clarify standing, like on the question of the blurred lines between strategic systems and then tactical systems. And a couple of dialogues that I took part in with the Chinese, at least we made sure that they understood that from our perspective, it would be the potentially very serious consequences to go after the DSP or SBIRs. Even if it's because they say, well, we'd only be doing it because it's supporting tactical operations. Our response is basically, don't go there. We're telling you, just don't go there. So I think opening up to expand on the concept of communication, to include a dialogue, to at least have a forum where these issues can be hashed out, ideally at the government level, but if not that, or in addition to that, at an experts level, I think would be a generally helpful step.
Okay, we're going to open this up to the audience. We have microphones that will come around, so when I call on you, if you can stand up, give your name and affiliation if you have one, and a question ends with a question mark and is not a statement. So let's begin right here.
Thank you. Mark Becker, Georgetown University. I was wondering if you also thought, apart from the cases of unintentional, intentional escalation, about some possible gray zone activity that could be happening in space that would be specifically designed to go, like, undermine or go not quite to the thresholds, whatever they may be. So something like rendezvous and proximity operations that could go all the way from intercepting data to manipulating satellites. Thank you.
And just to clarify, do you mean that could then itself lead to miscalculation, or do you mean in and of itself just the gray area?
Well, I was also interested in how that plays with when you set thresholds.
Got it. Okay. Gray area
I'll-
sounds like Zach. Over
yeah,
to you.
I'll take a first shot at that. Kath and I, along with a number of others, have just finished earlier in the year a long report on gray zone dynamics, so something we've thought a bit about. I think the real challenge with gray zones is that you don't know where the threshold is. And this is, again, what we've already been talking about earlier. And so one answer for dealing with gray zones is you instill a clear understanding on the part of your adversary of exactly where the thresholds are and of your seriousness about upholding those thresholds. I think the challenge in space is that requires very clear communication and trust, right? You have to actually believe that your adversary or your competitor is willing to escalate in a certain way if you cross a threshold. So you have to have those conversations. Now, where we've looked at this earlier in the year in the maritime domain, this is a bit easier to do, right? The US and China, for example, have large numbers of military dialogues with military officers and defense officials that interact with each other on a weekly or monthly basis. So there's a lot of trust built up in those relationships. The much harder thing is to do this in space where you don't have that kind of trust, you don't have the communication. You may not even have track 1.5, and you definitely don't have the track 1 dialogues that you would want. And so I think that's a challenge. And then again, there's a real tension between having a very clear red line, which is helpful to deter against gray zone escalations, and having enough flexibility that if something happens that, as Todd was saying, is a reversible attack that maybe doesn't have strategic effects, that you then don't have to make a very large escalation because you promised to do so. So there's some real tensions in that area, and I think it's going to be hard for policymakers to come up with these answers. And the last thought I have on this is that one of the challenges is that so much of the US debate happens in highly classified environments, right? And so part of our thinking and the Secure World Foundation's thinking in doing an unclassified discussion of these issues is that you have to start debating them in unclassified settings so that you can get those allies and partners into the room. And that's one thing we've just got to do more of.
I would also add that it's definitely something that we looked at in the paper, and there's a section written in there about gray zone threats. And one of the challenges is when you have this super high level of classification of everything, that actually gives adversaries more opportunities to use gray zone type tactics in space. And so I want to go to one of the slides here. The threat slide. So if you want to use Greystone type attacks, you want something where attribution is a little more difficult or it's more limited, where it's reversible, that you can kind of turn it on, turn it off, right? Gives you a lot of flexibility. Awareness, we're talking public awareness there, where it's not immediately evident to other people that anything is going on. So in the example of like dazzling a satellite, the person who's doing the dazzling will know that they tried to do it. The person on the receiving end of it, whose satellite is affected, they will know something happened and they'll have a good idea where it came from. No one else will know, though. And then, if you're the one who just got attacked, if they successfully dazzled or maybe even blinded your satellite, do you want to give that battle damage assessment to your adversary, or do you want to keep it secret? You probably want to keep it secret. So then what's to stop them from continuing to do it? And then if all of a sudden the U.S. says we're, retaliating in some way against this country, well, the public is going to ask, why? Why are you retaliating? And if you haven't told people and you haven't prepared them, it's going to be hard to make that case, and so it makes it less credible that you would respond. And so, and if you look through all the different forms of attacks, there are a lot of things that fall into these categories, and I worry that we're not thinking very well about what will we do if this happens. And ideally, we would want to have a lot of different rungs on our escalation ladder, so we can have a lot of fidelity of things that we could choose to go up a little bit more, a little bit less. But if we haven't thought through this in advance and planned this out, when the situation happens, we might not even be aware of what all those options are.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just have a really quick thought on that, and I want to say I think that what's happening now is actually exactly this, a lot of activity in gray zones, in that countries, not just our potential adversaries, but even us, we are seeking to demonstrate capabilities in ways that are not necessarily good. In that we are doing things like putting up things like autonomous proximity operations vehicles. We've put stuff up. The Russians put stuff up. The people are out there experimenting with blinding and jamming and all kinds of things. And this is all going on behind the curtain. And we're not talking to our publics about it, but we're not talking to our allies about it, and we're not really talking to our potential adversaries about when is that effort by you to poke us to see not only what you can do, but how we might respond to what you do. When is that poke going to be so hard that I'm going to feel like I need to poke back? And we don't know the answer to that question. So we're playing a bit of a dangerous game right now with trying to demonstrate capabilities, if you will, in a very gray area, and without actually having a conversation about what we're doing. And I think that's what makes the situation scary right now. You've got people experimenting with these capabilities, potential counterspace capabilities, and that's everyone. It's not just Russia or China. It's not just bad guys. It's lots of people. And we're not really talking about what we think we're going to do or at what point we're going to be so upset by somebody messing around that we're going to feel like we have to respond. And that means we need more communication and dialogue and all those other things, which goes back to the problem of classification. So we've got to kind of straighten up our own house here in the United States before we can have these conversations outside.
Move to another question because we'll run out of time right here.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with Space News. I wanted to follow up on Todd's point about DoD, different silos within DoD being divided on what's an attack or what's not an attack. Who do you see taking the lead on answering some of these questions? And on a separate note, now Congress is trying to create a Space Corps. Is that potentially going to complicate everything because countries are going to read different things into it? Thanks.
I'm going to take one more because I think this will be the end. So I'm going to look this direction in case anyone had a question. Yeah, we went all the way over here. Thank you.
Hi, Allison McGrath from the National Academy's Space Studies Board. I have a question relative to international collaboration, sort of what Hitchens and McDonald were discussing. In reference to NASA, NASA researchers are banned from working with Chinese researchers. And so this comes to the expertise level, and it's also political. So if we were to break those types of bans, are those the movements that we need to make to work with the Chinese, or are they too far hurt? Is it already, you think there would be a response there if we were to get rid of those types of bans?
Okay, we're going to actually start at the end because poor Bruce, by being at the end, always has to go last. So you get to go first. Any pieces of either of those two sets of questions?
Let me address the second question. For starters, I think that on the civilian side, I think the Chinese would respond pretty positively if we were to open the door. Again, they feel insulted. I mean, they might pout a little bit or something when we first make an offer, but I think there's the possibility for upside far exceeds the possibility for downside, and I would think it would send a reassuring note that we obviously aren't going to, reveal lots of or any classified information. But and also, surprise, surprise, China might actually bring something to the table. They are no slouches when it comes to space technology, and as everybody I think here knows, these things are not exactly inexpensive. And so there would be, I think there's a lot of upside, and I think the time for clearly the path of trying to change Chinese human rights policy via space has to be declared a failure, and I think let's pursue human rights concerns, but this is not the way to go about it. So I think there's a lot of upside there for the United States and China both.
Right. Teresa, either of those questions?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Bruce said on that. I think we'd probably all agree that there is no longer any benefit to this sort of boycotting of China in the civil space arena. The Chinese have made great progress on their manned space programs, and as well as other civil space activities. They are developing technology. They have something to give to the international effort for deep space exploration and the future of mankind in space. And it would be a channel of communications that we desperately need. So this is not only backfired, it's actively harming us, both from a national security viewpoint and from an international security viewpoint. So that's got to change. How to do that? That's another question. But it does have to change. And to Sandra's point, I think this is actually one of the big problems. We have different silos, different communities within the U.S. national security space community. And the intelligence community, for example, has a different set of priorities and perhaps, I would say, a different mindset or culture than you would find in, say, the Air Force or Strategic Command. And they've all not only got different priorities and different missions, they also have budget issues. And a lot of this comes down to the money. Follow the money. There's always competition for where that money goes. This has been part of the problem with the Air Force and space for many, many years, is that the Air Force has not put a high priority on space with regard to spending. The actual amount of spending, the amount of government money that's gone into the military space programs has stayed about the same amount, somewhere between $20 billion and $25 billion for more than a decade, okay? So we've been saying we have more and more problems, we have more and more emphasis on space, but the actual spending on it has not gone up. And Todd can echo me on this. So we've got serious internal problems where we haven't resolve these things, and that's the reason that this proposal for the Space Corps came out, was to try to say, okay, there's all these strands, could we just put them all together? Intellectually, that makes sense. Bureaucratically, not as easy. It's easier said than done because it would be quite difficult and disruptive to the current efforts. But I haven't made a decision on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I think there are pros and cons. In a way, though, I'm glad that it's come up, because it's raised the question of what are the priorities internally for military space and for national security space here in the United States.
Okay, I'm going to let Todd have the last words, because I think you'll have a couple things you'll want to react to there, so go ahead.
Okay. One thing I would add to the discussion about bringing China in as a partner for space exploration, we wrote a paper, I think 2 years ago now, it's in Strategic Studies Quarterly, about this idea. And I would just point out that if you do it, you have to do it in close consultation with your existing partners, particularly countries like our European partners and Japan, and coordinate with them before you go and start doing something new with China, because you don't want to add a new partner at the expense of others. We want more partners, not fewer, in civil space exploration. And China does come with something that some of our other partners don't have, which is money. And if we want to do the big dreams that are being talked about going to the moon and Mars, it's going to require money. And I do look at our budget, and we don't have a lot of that. Now, in terms of thinking through these thresholds and getting a common understanding across our own government, I don't think there's any one particular belly button that can do that, because our space capabilities are not just within the Air Force, they aren't just within DoD, they're also across the intel community, organizations like the NRO, NGA. So I think you've got to bring all those stakeholders into it. But where's the organizing office? I think it would make sense that in OSD policy, we already have an office, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. That probably is a good coordinating point to start facilitating these discussions. But really, I think it's about consensus building within the overall government space community. In terms of the Space Corps and the larger debate going on right now about space reorganization, I don't think it solves it. at all. The proposal that's in the House Armed Services version of the NDAA, it would just consolidate the Air Force's space capabilities into a separate service, but still under the Department of the Air Force. Doesn't really change much on its own. It's not going to add more money for space, for example. It just moves the money from one budget account to another. What it would do, though, is it would elevate some of these space issues, in particular because the way they do it, you would have a new chief of staff of the Space Corps that would be a member of the Joint Chiefs. If you do that, then you now have a voice on the Joint Chiefs whose job is to think about space. It still doesn't cover it all, though, because it doesn't cover the space capabilities in the Navy, the Army, or the intel community. So there'd still be work to do, but if anything, it might elevate the debate.
Great. Well, we did run at a brisk pace as expected, so I'm sure there are more follow-up questions. I'll leave that for another time. I do want to thank, of course, Todd and Zach for their report, Escalation and Deterrence in the Second Space Age, which is now available at CSIS. I also want to acknowledge and thank their co-authors, Caitlin Johnson and Thomas Roberts, who I think are both, I see Caitlin, I think Thomas is in this room somewhere. So thank you, both of you as well. And a special thanks to Bruce McDonald and Teresa Hitchens for coming and having this conversation with us. Congratulations on the anniversary of Sputnik. Congratulations to all space lovers everywhere. Please join me in a round of applause.